The thunder rolled across the dusty plains as Jake Norwood rode through the downpour, blood seeping from the wound in his side, his eyes as empty as the barren landscape around him. He'd been riding for 3 days straight since the ambush that had claimed the lives of his fellow rangers, and something deeper than physical pain gnawed at him, a hollowness that told him whatever made a man human had been shot out of him somewhere between El Paso and this God-forsaken stretch of nowhere. It was 1878, and the Texas frontier was as beautiful as it was merciless. Jake had spent 6 years as a Texas Ranger, hunting outlaws and protecting settlers, but the ambush had changed everything. 5 good men dead, and he couldn't remember how he'd survived. Only fragments remained: gunfire, screams, his horse bolting with him barely conscious in the saddle. The rain washed away his blood but couldn't cleanse the emptiness. When his horse finally gave out near a small settlement called Redemption Springs, Jake barely managed to dismount before collapsing in the mud outside what appeared to be a doctor's office. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was a pair of worried green eyes peering down at him from beneath the shelter of a porch. Those eyes belonged to Madeline Evans, the town's young doctor who had taken over her father's practice after his passing 6 months prior. At 24, she faced daily skepticism from townspeople who doubted a woman could practice medicine properly, but none could deny her skilled hands had saved many lives. "Help me get him inside," she called to the blacksmith across the street. Together they dragged Jake's unconscious form into her clinic. Hours later, Jake awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of clean sheets and the sharp smell of antiseptic. His side was bandaged, and the pain had dulled to a persistent throb. "You're lucky to be alive," said a soft voice from the corner of the room. Madeline stepped into the lamplight, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. "That bullet came mighty close to your liver." Jake stared at her with empty eyes. "Luck had nothing to do with it, madam. I'm Dr. Evans, Madeline Evans." She approached the bed, checking his temperature with the back of her hand against his forehead. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. Care to tell me your name?" "Jake Norwood, Texas Ranger." He spoke mechanically, like reciting words from a distant memory. "Or I was." "Was?" she asked, changing his bandage with efficient movements. "Men died." "Good men. I lived. Doesn't seem right to keep wearing the badge." Madeline studied his face, noting the hollow look in his eyes that spoke of something far worse than physical trauma. "Well, Mr. Norwood, your body's healing fine, but I suspect there's other damage that needs tending." Jake turned his face to the wall. "Some things can't be fixed, doctor. You can patch up flesh and bone, but that's all." Over the next week, Jake recovered physically under Madeline's care. The bullet wound closed, his fever broke, and his strength gradually returned. But the emptiness remained. He spoke little, ate mechanically, and spent hours staring out the clinic window at the dusty main street of Redemption Springs. Sheriff Cooper visited on the 3rd day, having recognized Jake's name. "You're somewhat of a legend, Ranger Norwood," the sheriff said, settling his considerable bulk in the chair beside Jake's bed. "Heard about what happened near El Paso. Terrible business." "I'm not a ranger anymore," Jake replied flatly. "Just a man passing through." "Well, if you're looking to stay put for a while, we could use someone with your experience. Town's growing, and trouble comes with growth." Jake gave no answer, and the sheriff eventually left, tipping his hat to Madeline on the way out. That evening, Madeline found Jake attempting to dress himself, his movements stiff with pain. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded, crossing her arms. "Been imposing on your hospitality long enough, doctor. Time I moved on." "To where exactly? With what horse?" "Your mount died shortly after you arrived." Her voice softened. Besides, you're in no condition to travel. Jake paused, his shirt half-buttoned. I don't belong here. You don't belong bleeding out on the trail either. Madeline gestured toward the bed. One more week. Doctor's orders. Something flashed in Jake's eyes, perhaps the ghost of amusement, before he grudgingly complied. As days passed, Jake began helping around the clinic, first with small tasks that wouldn't strain his wound, then with increasingly complex ones. He organized Madeline's medical supplies, repaired a leaky roof, and even assisted with setting a young boy's broken arm, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he comforted the frightened child. Madeline observed these moments closely, seeing glimpses of the man beneath the emptiness. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the western sky, she finally asked the question that had been troubling her. What happened out there, Jake? What really happened? The long silence that followed made her think he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. We were tracking the Sutton gang, 7 of us Rangers against their 12. We'd been hunting them for months after they massacred a family near Fort Worth. Jake stared into the distance. Should have seen the ambush coming. They were waiting in a canyon, opened fire before we knew what was happening. His hands tightened on the porch railing. I watched them die, every single one of my brothers. Captain Reynolds took 3 bullets pushing me to cover, told me to stay alive to finish it. Then he just stopped breathing. Jake's voice broke. I killed 4 of the gang before the rest fled, but it didn't bring anyone back. Madeline placed her hand gently over his. You survived for a reason, Jake. He pulled his hand away. That's what haunts me most, Doc. I don't feel anything anymore. It's like whatever made me human bled out in that canyon. I'm just empty, walking dead. Madeline watched him with compassionate eyes. The body heals faster than the heart, Jake Norwood. Give yourself time. The following day, Jake was splitting firewood behind the clinic when gunshots erupted from the direction of the bank. Without hesitation, he grabbed his pistol from the nearby stump and ran toward the commotion, ignoring the pulling pain in his side. 3 masked men were backing out of the bank, guns trained on terrified citizens. The sheriff lay wounded on the boardwalk, struggling to reach his dropped weapon. Jake moved with cold precision, taking cover behind a water trough. Drop your weapons, he called out, his ranger training taking over. The robbers turned, opening fire. Jake returned fire with deadly accuracy, winging one man's shoulder and forcing them all to scatter for cover. A fierce gunfight ensued, with the townspeople diving for safety as bullets splintered wood and shattered glass. One robber made a break for the horses tied nearby. Jake emerged from cover, aimed carefully, and shot the man's gun from his hand. The second robber, seeing his companion disarmed, surrendered quickly. The third, however, darted into the general store, dragging a young woman as hostage. Come any closer and she dies, the man shouted, pressing his gun to the woman's temple. Jake stepped into the doorway, his gun trained steadily. Let her go. This doesn't end well for you either way. Back off, the robber shouted, panic making his voice crack. Jake noticed the hostage's eyes wide with terror but looking directly at him. In them, he saw a trust he didn't deserve. With deliberate slowness, he lowered his weapon. I'm putting my gun down, he said calmly. But think about what you're doing. Kill her, and you won't leave this town alive. The robber's eyes darted nervously. Jake took a step forward, hands raised. You've still got a chance to live through this. More than my friends got. Something in Jake's tone, the raw honesty of a man who had seen too much death, penetrated the robber's panic. His grip on the woman loosened slightly. In that instant, Jake lunged forward with surprising speed, tackling both the robber and hostage to the floor while twisting the gun away. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Jake subdued the would-be killer with brutal efficiency. By nightfall, all three robbers were locked in the town jail. The sheriff was recovering under Madeline's care, and Jake found himself being celebrated as a hero in the town's saloon. He accepted a whiskey but sat apart from the revelry, the familiar emptiness still echoing inside him despite the day's events. Madeline found him there hours later, nursing the same drink. "Sheriff Cooper will live," she said, sliding onto the bench across from him. "Thanks in no small part to your actions today." Jake nodded silently. "You know what I saw out there today?" she continued, her eyes searching his face. "A man who risked his life for strangers, a man who chose the harder path to save a hostage rather than simply shooting through her. Just did what needed doing," he muttered. "No." Madeline reached across the table and took his hand firmly. "A man without a soul doesn't place himself between innocence and danger. He doesn't care if a hostage lives or dies." Jake looked up, meeting her gaze for perhaps the first time without shadows clouding his eyes. "You saved lives today, Jake Norwood. Not because you were ordered to, but because somewhere inside you still care." Something cracked in Jake's carefully constructed emptiness. He withdrew his hand and stood abruptly. "Good night, Doctor," he said, and walked out into the cool evening air. The following weeks brought subtle changes. Jake took on odd jobs around town, repairing fences, breaking horses for the livery stable, occasionally helping the still recovering sheriff with his duties. He rented a small room above the gunsmith shop and established a quiet routine. Madeline watched from a distance, giving him space while ensuring their paths crossed regularly. She invited him for Sunday dinners, requested his help with clinic repairs, and gradually drew him into the community. Each interaction chipped away at the wall he'd built around himself. One stormy evening, a desperate father pounded on Madeline's door, his young daughter burning with fever in his arms. Jake, who happened to be reinforcing her windows against the coming storm, helped usher them inside. For hours, they worked together to bring the child's fever down. Jake fetched water, mixed medicines at Madeline's direction, and held the frightened girl's hand while telling her stories of friendly ghosts who protected lost travelers in the desert. Dawn was breaking when the fever finally broke. The exhausted father wept with relief as his daughter slipped into a peaceful sleep. "You should get some rest," Jake told Madeline as they cleaned up the examination room. "You've been awake over 24 hours. "As have you," she replied, noticing how the shadows under his eyes made the blue irises seem even more intense. "Those stories you told her, where did they come from?" A faint smile touched Jake's lips. "My mother. She believed the world was full of guardian spirits. Said even the most lost souls had someone watching over them." "Do you believe that?" Madeline asked softly. The smile faded. "Used to, not so much anymore. I think your mother would be proud of how you helped that little girl tonight." Jake didn't respond, but later that day, Madeline found a small wooden carving of a horse on her desk, crude but carefully crafted, with a note that simply read, "For the next frightened child, J." Summer arrived, bringing with it scorching heat and the annual town festival. Despite Jake's reluctance, Madeline persuaded him to attend, insisting that the entire town wanted to thank their reluctant hero properly. The town square had been transformed with colored bunting, food stalls, and a makeshift dance floor. Musicians played lively tunes as couples twirled beneath paper lanterns strung between buildings. Jake stood at the periphery, uncomfortable with the attention but unwilling to disappoint Madeline. She found him there, looking more presentable than she'd ever seen him, clean-shaven, hair trimmed, wearing a new shirt she suspected he'd purchased specifically for the occasion. "You clean up rather nicely, Mr. Norwood," she said with a smile, offering him a glass of lemonade. Feel like a show pony, he grumbled, but accepted the drink. Everyone's staring. They're looking at the man who's become an important part of this community, Madeline corrected, whether you intended to or not. The evening progressed pleasantly, with Jake gradually relaxing as he interacted with townspeople who now treated him as one of their own. When the music slowed, Madeline took a chance and extended her hand. Dance with me, Jake hesitated. Been a long time since I danced with anyone. Then it's about time you remembered how. His hand engulfed hers as he led her to the dance floor. For a big man, he moved with surprising grace, guiding her with gentle confidence. Where did you learn to dance like this? She asked, surprised. My father believed a gentleman should know how to dance properly, he replied. Made sure I learned before I was old enough to protest. He sounds like a wise man. He was. A shadow crossed Jake's face. Lost him and my mother to fever when I was 16. That's when I headed west. Madeline's heart ached for the young boy who had lost everything. I lost my father last year. That's why I returned from medical school in Philadelphia to take over his practice. You're good at it, better than most doctors I've known, even though I'm a woman. She challenged, with a raised eyebrow. For the first time in her presence, Jake laughed a genuine sound that transformed his face. Especially because you're a woman. Most male doctors I've met were too busy showing off their knowledge to actually listen to their patients. The music ended, but they remained close, something unspoken passing between them. The moment was shattered by shouts from the edge of the square. A rider was galloping into town, his horse lathered with exertion. Comanche raid, the man cried out, nearly falling from his mount. Henderson's farm, they took his daughter. The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly. Sheriff Cooper, still moving stiffly from his healing wound, pushed through the crowd. How many? 6, maybe 7, the rider gasped. They hit at sunset, killed 2 farmhands, took Lucy Henderson. Can't be more than an hour ahead. Jake was already moving toward the livery. Cooper, gather 5 men who can ride and shoot. I'll meet you at the north edge of town in 10 minutes. The authority in his voice brooked no argument. Cooper nodded and began selecting volunteers. Madeline hurried after Jake as he saddled the bay gelding he'd purchased weeks earlier. You're going after them, she said. It wasn't a question. Lucy's 17. You know what will happen to her if we don't get her back fast. His hands worked efficiently, checking his rifle and pistol. I'm coming with you. Jake paused, turning to face her. No, she'll need medical attention, and I can ride and shoot as well as most men in this town. Madeline, this isn't a discussion, Jake. She was already grabbing her medical bag. Lucy is my patient and my friend. Their eyes locked in a battle of wills until Jake finally gave a curt nod. Stay close to me. Do exactly as I say. Within minutes, a party of 8 riders thundered north out of Redemption Springs, following the trail by moonlight. Jake rode at the front, his ranger training evident in how he read the signs and set the pace. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. By dawn, Jake held up his hand for silence, pointing to smoke rising from a sheltered canyon ahead. They're camped there, he whispered as the group gathered around him. Probably think they're far enough that no one would follow so quickly, Cooper nodded. What's the plan? We need to know exactly where the girl is before we move in, Jake said. I'll scout ahead. The rest of you circle around to these positions. He sketched a quick map in the dirt. When you hear my shot, move in but hold your fire unless absolutely necessary. The girl's safety comes first. Madeline watched as Jake transformed completely into the ranger he once was, decisive, strategic, and absolutely focused. For the first time, she truly understood the man he had been before tragedy struck. I'm coming with you, she said quietly. Jake started to object, then reconsidered. Stay low. Move exactly as I do. Together they crept closer to the camp, using the brush for cover. 6 Comanche warriors moved around a small fire, while a 7th guarded a frightened young woman tied to a tree. Lucy's face was tear-stained but resolute. Jake studied the situation, then whispered, "There's a moment coming when they'll all be distracted. When I fire, run directly to Lucy, cut her free and get her to those rocks." He pointed to an outcropping 50 yards away. "Don't stop for anything. Understand?" Madeline nodded, gripping the knife he handed her. Jake positioned himself carefully, then fired a shot that took down the warrior guarding Lucy. Chaos erupted in the camp as the sheriff and his men opened fire from their positions. Madeline ran, keeping low as Jake had instructed, reaching Lucy and quickly cutting her bonds. "Come on," she urged, pulling the terrified girl toward the rocks. They were halfway there when a mounted warrior broke free from the firefight, riding straight for them. Madeline pushed Lucy ahead. "Keep going," she shouted, turning to face the threat with only a knife in her hand. The warrior bore down on her, raising his weapon. A shot rang out and the Comanche fell from his horse. Jake appeared beside her, grabbing her arm. "I told you not to stop," he growled, pulling both women behind the shelter of the rocks. The skirmish was brief but intense. When it ended, 2 Comanche warriors lay dead, one was wounded and the others had fled. None of the townsmen were seriously injured, though 2 sported minor wounds that Madeline quickly treated. Lucy, though traumatized, was physically unharmed. She clung to Madeline on the ride home, finally falling into exhausted sleep against her back. As they approached town, Jake rode beside Madeline. "That was a foolish thing you did, standing your ground against that warrior. I couldn't let him reach Lucy. You could have been killed." "So could you, every time you step between danger and innocence," she countered. "Yet you do it without hesitation." Jake fell silent, considering her words. Finally, he said, "You remind me of someone I used to know." "Who?" "Me. Before El Paso." When they returned to Redemption Springs, the town erupted in celebration at Lucy's safe return. Her parents embraced her tearfully while townsfolk gathered to hear the story of the rescue. That night, Jake sat alone on the steps of the church, away from the celebration. Madeline found him there, staring up at the stars. "Lucy will recover," she said, settling beside him. "She's stronger than she looks," Jake nodded. "People usually are. You were different out there today," Madeline observed. "Like you came alive again." "Old habits," he dismissed. "No, it was more than that." She turned to face him fully. "When that warrior was charging toward us, I saw your face. You weren't empty then, Jake. You were terrified not for yourself but for me and Lucy." He looked away. "Doesn't mean anything. It means everything." Madeline took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You think your soul died with your friends in that canyon, but it didn't. I see it right here." She placed her hand over his heart. "Still beating, still caring, still capable of love." Something broke in Jake, then a dam holding back everything he'd refused to feel since the ambush. His shoulders shook as the grief he'd denied for so long finally found release. Madeline held him as he wept, her own tears mingling with his. When the storm passed, Jake looked at her with eyes that were different, wounded still, but no longer empty. "I don't know how to be that man again," he admitted. "The one who believed in things, who had purpose." "You don't have to be who you were," Madeline said softly. "Just be who you are now, someone who's survived terrible loss but still chooses to protect others. Someone who carves wooden horses for frightened children and dances beautifully under paper lanterns." Jake's hand came up to cover hers, still resting over his heart. "I think I started finding myself again the moment you pulled that bullet out of me, Madeline Evans." "Well," she smiled through her tears. "I am an excellent doctor." For the first time, he smiled without shadows. "The best I've known." Their lips met in a kiss that held the promise of healing, of new beginnings woven from damaged pasts. When they finally parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "Stay in Redemption Springs," she whispered. "Not just for the town, for me. I'm not whole," he warned. "Might never be completely, none of us are. That's why we need each other." As summer turned to fall, Jake accepted Sheriff Cooper's offer to become his deputy. The badge felt different from his Ranger star lighter somehow, a promise rather than a burden. He moved into a small house near Madeline's clinic, spending his days enforcing the law and his evenings helping her tend to patients, or simply sitting on her porch, watching the sunset. Word of his past exploits as a ranger spread, and occasionally men would seek him out, some wanting to test their speed against his, others offering him jobs as a hired gun. He turned them all away, having found something in Redemption Springs worth more than reputation or revenge. On Christmas Eve, 6 months after the bank robbery that had first revealed his character to the town, Jake stood nervously in Madeline's small parlor. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a modest tree decorated with paper ornaments stood in the corner, many made by children Madeline had treated. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small wooden box he had carved himself. Madeline opened it to find a simple gold ring nestled inside. "Jake, I can't promise it will be easy," he said, taking her hands in his. "But I can promise that whatever soul I have left belongs entirely to you, Madeline. You saw it when I couldn't. You believed in it when I'd given up. And if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of that faith." Tears glistened in her eyes as she pressed the ring into his hand. "Ask me properly, Jake Norwood," he smiled, dropping to one knee. "Madeline Evans, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she whispered as he slid the ring onto her finger. "With all my heart, yes." They were married in the spring of 1879, with the whole town in attendance. Sheriff Cooper stood as Jake's best man, and Lucy Henderson, fully recovered from her ordeal, served as Madeline's maid of honor. Life in the West remained challenging. Drought years followed by floods, occasional outlaw troubles, and the ever-changing frontier. But through it all, Jake and Madeline built a life together that honored both their pasts while creating something entirely new. Their first child, a son they named Robert after Madeline's father, arrived a year after their wedding. Their daughter Sarah followed 2 years later. The children grew up in a home filled with their father's wooden carvings and their mother's books, learning both how to ride and how to heal. Jake never returned to the Rangers, but his reputation as a fair and courageous lawman spread throughout the territory. When statehood came, he was offered the position of county sheriff, a role he accepted with Madeline's full support. On their 10th anniversary, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the land that had given them both a second chance. "You ever regret staying here?" Madeline asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "Choosing this life instead of returning to the Rangers?" Jake looked down at their intertwined hands, hers still delicate despite years of medical work, his weathered but steady. "Not for a single moment," he said truthfully. "You were right that day, you know." "About what?" "About my soul." He pulled her closer. "It wasn't gone. Just lost until you found it." Madeline smiled up at the man who had once been hollow but now stood solid and complete beside her. "I always knew it was there. Some things are too precious to ever truly lose." As darkness settled over Redemption Springs, they turned toward the warmth of their home, where their children waited, and the future continued to unfold, not without challenges, but always with the certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. their souls intertwined in the kind of love that could only be found once all hope seemed lost.